That was Bungalow Way by the Explorers at 29 minutes past 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Wichita's #1 station for rock and roll, 1240 KAKE. It's 63 degrees out at Wichita's Mid-Continent Airport, where there's a report that the new Learjet we've all been hearing about has actually taken off in the past half hour on its first ever test flight. It's expected to return before dark, which is about an hour from now. That might be something worth seeing. In other news, President Kennedy announced today at his weekly press conference.
On the evening of October 7th, 1963, there was a traffic jam in Wichita on, of all places, the stretch of K-42 between Hoover and Tyler Roads at the south end of Mid-Continent Airport. More than 100 cars were pulled off to the side of the road. Their headlights were visible from the runways and from the Lear Jet plant at the north end of the field. They were also visible from 5,000 feet in the air and 2 miles to the south, where the first Learjet, a Model 23, was making its approach. According to the pilots of that new jet aircraft, it was a sight to behold. Headlights literally marking the Learjet's way back to the ground at the end of its very first flight. It was also the beginning of an era and an industry, business aviation, that has now reached its 40th year. I'm Roger Cornish, and this is the story of that historic flight, the man who put his fortune on the line to make it happen, and the airplane that became the epitome of business aircraft performance and a household word in the process. Recently, a group of original Learjet employees, men who remember Bill Lear, the birth of the Learjet, and business aviation, gathered to reminisce about those early days. Bill Lear was born in Hannibal, Missouri, a year before the Wright brothers first flew. He moved to Chicago as a boy and grew up there. A precocious youngster with a bent for technical things, he earned an early reputation for ingenuity and a disdain for boring schoolwork. Quitting school in the 8th grade, he set out to be an innovator and inventor. By his early 20s, he had developed the first practical car radio, a Victrola for the motor vehicle, or Motorola. He began amassing his first fortune when he sold the rights to the device to the company that still bears that name. Moving on to the fledgling aviation industry, Bill applied his creative talents to enhancing navigation. The self-taught engineer eventually designed and built the Lyroscope, the first automatic direction finder and first practical autopilot. By the time he was in his 30s, he was a well-known force in aviation. In 1954, he won the prestigious Collier Trophy for inventing the F-86 autopilot. By the mid-50s, Bill Lear held a number of patents for sophisticated electronic devices and was the CEO of Lear Siegler, Inc.
Well, he was the chairman of the board of Lear Incorporated. It merged finally with Siegler, Lear Siegler Incorporated, and he had invented several actuators and autopilots and so forth. He had received the Collier Trophy for the F-86 autopilot.
Even as his focus turned to building a business jet, he continued to develop new ideas, including the 8-track car stereo. But the high-performance business jet that would eventually bear his name was on his mind, even before he developed the 8-track. He began by surrounding himself with people who could help him make his dream a reality. Among them was well-known pilot and entrepreneur Clay Lacy.
I have a speech somewhere, I haven't seen it for a while, that Bill Lear gave in 1959 in Wichita to the Society of Automotive Engineers. And anyway, he told the people in Wichita what they should build. The jet airliners were coming along in 1959, 707s and DC-8s. And in this speech, Bill described this Learjet, Learjet 23, and what it should do. And he said, I'm giving you guys 3 years, I believe it was, to build it. If you haven't started on it in 3 years, I'm going to build it. And that was an absolute true statement. He did it. They didn't start on it, and he built it.
Another key player in the history of the Learjet, even before it was designed, was a military test pilot by the name of Hank Beard.
I heard he was going to build, he was talking about building, rumors he was going to build this Learjet, and I just finished the spin test on the F-105, and I finished that program, so I wanted to get in on early design and the flight of this one.
Of course, in the late 50s, creating a business jet from scratch would obviously require a lot of experienced designers and significant sums of money. Thanks to his inventive genius, Bill had some money. And fortunately for him, in Switzerland, he was able to find some readily available engineering expertise and a platform upon which to base the design of his airplane. Under the direction of respected Swiss designer Dr. Hans Studer, he began to build a team.
Dr. Studer was designing the P-16 over at FFA, and it had almost an identical wing to the Learjet, the one we used. In the meantime, Bill was down in Geneva designing a Learjet down there and so he found out about what Dr. Studer was doing, and he said, Dr. Studer, I want you, since you designed that and they're not going to build it, I want you to take what you can off of that airplane and design me a hot rod Learjet. And since the wing was almost identical, we used all of that wind tunnel analysis that's all we had. We would have never had any money to run a wind tunnel test, so thank goodness we were able to use that data.
We first got over to Switzerland. The P-16 was just being canceled, and all these engineers, just like Wichita, had nothing to do. So Bill found these engineers at half price, like he said. He had an eye for that, and that's why we started designing it there.
With Dr. Studer acting as chief designer, Bill Lear went about the task of picking off some of the industry's best talent to fill out his team. He hired Hank Waring from rival Cessna and Gordon Israel from Saberliner as well. If offering them the title of chief engineer was required to lure them away from their previous positions, Bill didn't hesitate. By the time Don Gromish, who would eventually hold the chief engineer's title himself, joined the company, the organizational chart was getting a little confusing.
I've heard it described as an octopus. Here was Bill Lear, and he had these chief engineers, and you didn't know who you were supposed to take orders from.
Leading this diverse group, Bill Lear, the avionics genius, aircraft modifier, and intrepid pilot, succeeded the way he always did, by the sheer force of his will and flying by the seat of his pants.
I remember we were going up to Waldenburg, Switzerland to look at this watch company to make the landing gear, and it had this little 3,000-foot clover strip, and we had that Beech 18 you were talking about. Then when we were going out, Gordon Israel was the chief engineer at that time, and he got in the back with two other big guys, and here we are with a full load of an airplane, and we got a foot of alfalfa to take off in. So I taxied, he was taxiing out, and I finished the taxi and put the tail right up against the fence on one end, and I held the brakes until he got as much power as the tail started coming up off the ground. And we started rolling, and we got down pretty close to the other end, and it was kind of bumping along, trying to get to flying. And a Beech is kind of like a Lear Star. You don't use much flaps on takeoff, so I eased down about 5 degrees, and it finally came into the air on a bump just before we got to the fence on the other end, and it got in the air enough to get the gear up, so I pulled it up. And Gordon was so mad, he came up in front, and he said, Bill, he said, you should have been in the back of this airplane. He said, it scared the holy hell out of me. And Bill turned around and said, you should have been up here.
With a Swiss design and an eclectic group of engineers from both Europe and the U.S., Bill eventually began searching for a place to build his corporate jet. Wichita, Kansas, the self-proclaimed air capital of the world, mounted an aggressive campaign to become the home of the new aircraft. But even as the hotbed of aviation manufacturing was making its bid to attract Learjet, many members of its aviation community were not so certain. Skeptics were legion. All over town, experts at competitors Cessna and Beech aircraft made no qualms about their doubts that the Learjet would ever fly. Some, however, didn't see it that way and were willing to take a chance on being a part of history.
I was with Beech, so I was across town sort of being one of the many skeptics that some of these guys had to encounter. But I think clearly he came here because this was where the labor market was. He could attract great engineers, great manufacturing people, great pilots, great finance people, and he simply came here and took part of the best that was to offer in Wichita. And I remember sitting at Beech, one by one, my colleagues would come over to Learjet And almost every month there would be a goodbye party for somebody, and it came to be known as we were the Italian boatmen, the gondoliers. And if you weren't working in this plant, you were probably a skeptic. And the general consensus was the airplane will never be built. If it's built, it'll never fly. If it flies, it'll never be certified. If it's certified, it'll never get delivered. And of course, all of these things happen. And one by one, the dissent and the skepticism just melted away through performance.
With his Italian boatmen and his band of international engineers, Bill Lear began piecing together an extraordinary airplane on the plains of Kansas.
Well, I think we were pretty confident the airplane would fly. The only biggest problem we had was time. The airplane obviously, when we brought it over here, didn't have any systems in it, and most of the systems were not even designed when the first flight was going to take place. All I had to go on was the aerodynamics that we had from the P-16, and we had about 2 weeks to test the whole airplane and decide whether or not it was going to be airworthy.
Bob Hagan and Hank Beard drew the assignment of piloting it on its first flight. Though an experienced military jet pilot, Hagan had been focusing on manufacturing while working at Lear Jet. Beard was working elsewhere, having grown weary of waiting for Bill Lear to actually build the airplane he'd been raving about. As a result, both were blissfully unaware of how much they didn't know.
Well, I'd have thought a lot more if I'd known what Don was saying.
Yeah, if I'd have known all that.
If I'd known all this structural stuff, I don't know, we'd still be sitting on the ground possibly.
He called me up one day, and I heard the engines running. He opened the door so I could hear them. And he said, Hank, we're getting ready to fly this thing. And so I said, let me speak to June. June was a secretary, very much like Sylvia. June will tell you the truth. I said, now, June, is the boss back in his office and you're outside? She says, yes. I said, tell me, is that airplane ready to fly? She said, it's running. From the first time he showed it to me on his boardroom table, I had no doubts about the airplane, whatever. The 8 spars in the wing, God, I've never flown an airplane with 8 spars in the wing. Even 747s don't even have it. And 5 spars in the tail. What do you want for structure?
What Hank was saying, 8 spars, the way this thing's built, it's built like a tank compared to other airplanes, and compared to airliners, which are only designed to 2.5 Gs. This airplane, when he tested the wing out here, static, Don, didn't it go up to like 13.5 Gs or something before it broke?
Never one to be accused of a hands-off management style, Lear got involved in virtually every aspect of the aircraft's development.
He'd be out there going around every drawing table, and you've probably seen pictures. I've got one classic where all the guys are laying over their table and Bill's going around, and they don't want him to see what the heck they're doing for fear he's going to sit there and change something, because at night, when all these guys would go home, he was around and they had these pretty drawings they worked real hard on, and he'd mark them up with a pencil. You'd come in the next morning and there's all this writing on your blackboard and with this WPL signed on it, and and you look at it and you try to figure out what in the world the guy was trying to tell you. But in essence, the guy really had a lot of good concepts, and you'd look at it, he'd give you the concept, and he was expecting you to take that concept and put it on a piece of paper and make it work.
Making it work became an obsession for everyone, because it was imperative that the radical new jet aircraft prove itself in the air as soon as possible. By the afternoon of October 7th, they knew they were close.
We didn't know we were going to fly that day.
That day, no, we didn't need to fly that day. It was dark.
So Hank and I climbed in and taxied out to runway 14, I believe it was. And he went one way and I went the other way, and that was the taxi runs. We brought it back and said we're ready to go, so they fueled it up. And I took it off, and I think it was 120 we were supposed to climb out. I rotated, it took off, it stuck right at 120.
Going up like a
and just stopped. Never gone up in an airplane like that on takeoff. Got it up to 2,000 feet and started wiggling it around a little bit. And I said, heck, that's all right with me. And let him fly it a little bit.
Well, the airplane flew beautifully. I said it just like it was. The airplane was amazing, and it was. I expected it to be a rocket, and it was better than that.
Mm-hmm. We come back around to land. Cars were lined up all along K42 with their lights on. It was dark.
All those skeptics were out there.
Yeah.
Somebody called the radio station.
Yes.
In fact, a lot of the guys were calling their families and telling them to get out there, and so the word spread quickly.
Well, they were lined up for miles down there, and it's
when I was coming around the base leg, I could see everybody all down the highway.
One of the best sights I've ever seen.
Yeah.
It turned out that October 7th was also Hagen's wedding anniversary, so he had a double reason to celebrate. His wife, however, may have seen it a bit differently.
I got a first flight, and we also got dinner that night, so I didn't have to take her out.
Flying the Learjet for the first time made believers out of many of the skeptics. More and more former critics began joining the ranks at the new jet maker, leaving established jobs at the competition for opportunities and challenges they thought they'd never even have a chance to address elsewhere. And there was plenty of work to be done. In order to get the airplane to the market before his resources ran out, Bill Lear took a rather risky approach, building the test aircraft on production tooling and developing key systems on the fly. Everyone worked virtually around the clock.
25 hours a day, Saturdays and Sundays. I always remember my wife used to bring our children out, and they would play in Bill Lear's office on Saturdays, and Moya would be on the floor playing with him, and that's when I got to see my family.
The risk nearly proved disastrous, but the looming cloud proved to have a silver lining.
The biggest thing that happened, caused the certification time to be short, was crashing the first airplane.
They were making rapid takeoffs and had one more to go, and they wanted to shut the engine completely down rather than just pull it back to idle on one side. And it was beginning to rain, so they turned around and didn't retract the spoilers. And they took off with the spoilers up, and it flew for a mile and a half out here before it crashed.
That it seemed to me that when that airplane crashed, and the FAA was involved with it, there was an FAA pilot in it, Bill gets on the phone with Barry Goldwater, Senator Kerr, everybody he knew, and he knew a bunch of people, and they got the head of the FAA on it. He gets on there and crying, and with these big crocodile tears, and kind of crying that they wrecked him. All of his money's in this airplane, and it was wrecked. And finally, they said, "What can we do to help you at this point?" And he says, "Have someone here 24 hours a day until we get this airplane." And Bill would schedule test flights for about 8 in the morning, but the engine would be off. There was a lot of problems. By the time they got around to Hank flying with him about 9, 10 o'clock at night, I think they got done in about an hour what it would have taken 2 flights earlier in the day.
Uncharacteristically, Bill had taken some extra precautions with his first airplane and had it fully insured. When the insurance company paid off, the first Learjet to fly, the first Learjet to be lost in a crash, also became the first Learjet to be sold at full list price. The proceeds helped keep the company going and the program alive.
We were glad it happened from an engineering standpoint because the airplane we had most of the Swiss parts in there, and they were all in the metric system. We could have never certified that airplane. So that airplane was sold at retail, as you say, and we would have never realized a dime out of that airplane if it hadn't crashed.
Bill Lear and his intrepid band of airplane builders continued to live a charmed life, even if money was tight. In a period of just over 9 months, they accomplished what many were still convinced was impossible.
I think I would have to say that getting the type certificate on the airplane was the greatest thrill that we ever had, because unless we got it certificated, we didn't have a company. We couldn't sell an airplane. You know, that was our baby. It became the Learjet. You know, when it flew, it was a Learjet, but when we got that type certificate, that meant the company, well, we could even borrow money. I mean, here we had something firm in our hands. We were a company now. Without that type certificate, we were nothing.
Bill Lear wasn't just the airplane's designer and chief financial source. He was its premier salesman as well.
Originally, look, the first few Learjets were sold by Bill Lear himself, to like Lowell Guinness and Baron Thiessen. Those were people he knew before.
But even with a stable full of high-profile customers and their deposits, money was tight. Once the airplane was certified, Bill Lear declared that the market for business jets was large and growing.
In 1963, the consensus through research that was done was that ultimately, for all time, there would be 300 business jets bought. And Bill Lear came along and said, no, that easily 3,000. And people absolutely laughed him out of the room.
In an effort to meet the demand, Learjet production accelerated faster than Bill Lear could afford. The business formula in the first year of production evolved into selling airplanes in order to make the company's payroll.
There was a civil war in Nigeria, and Biafra became an independent republic, and I had a call from the State Department that President Colonel Ojukwu wants a private airplane. So I said, okay, I'm on the way. Where the hell is Biafra? I'm on the way. And in New York, I got a call from, maybe it was either you or Harvey Anselm, has come back. Bill said, we don't have the money to go to Africa now. And I said, well, pretend you didn't get a hold of me. And I went on. When I got there, a man in a dirty shirt, open shirt, khakis, comes up to me behind me and whistled to me, Biafran intelligence, come with me. And we sold the airplane. That paid the last payroll.
I always remember Alex coming home and in his bag, he usually carried that darn stuff in his back pocket, check and cash hanging out of his back pocket, walking around the plant, and that's your payroll, he'd say, pat his back.
There's Brazilian big rancher, and in Sao Paulo, who signed the contract, and I said, I need $100,000 deposit we required at the time. He says, you'll have it before you leave. So I'm leaving this afternoon with my airline. Okay, no deposit. I'm waiting to board the airplane. Now here comes a man with a little neatly wrapped brown paper box. He says, here, what is this? I said, it's your deposit. I said, well, I look at it. I go into a little office, and so I'm going to count it. Christ, there were $5 bills, $10 bills, traveler's checks.
All in a vomit bag.
And nothing, no way I could count that. In the meantime, they called the flight. And the man said, okay, here's the receipt, signed $100,000. Well, I signed, I stuffed all this in a Varig six-sack, because it was illegal to take money out of Brazil. And I come here, and I walk into Bill's office, and on his desk, and I turned this six-sack like this.
Cash everywhere.
There was money everywhere. And then he calls me. He says, it's $100 short. I said, Bill, if I'm going to steal money from the company, it's going to be more than $100.
By virtue of their extraordinary performance, Learjets rapidly became the talk of the aviation industry. But with the new aircraft, a new potential set of customers was emerging. Bill Lear knew it was important to reach these prospective members of the jet set, and he put his PR and marketing experts onto the assignment.
Yeah, in those days when Bill wanted to make the name a household word, he thought the easiest way to do it was to get celebrities in. And man, I'd have to think about it, but we probably flew 100 people that were well known in those days. And a lot of them were his friends, like Art Linkletter had been a friend of Bill's for a long time, but Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., and just about everybody that was in Hollywood flew in the airplane.
But even with the beautiful people clamoring to own or fly in a Learjet, there were still business and opinion leaders who needed to be convinced. And the competition had begun to make some noises of its own.
So we leaped ahead at getting the Learjet featured in movies. Clay was a big part of that. On television shows, in other people's advertising, both print and broadcast. We went on tours with Hank, with movie stars, things like that to promote their movies. Danny Kaye took a Learjet around on a UNICEF tour. Hank Ketchum, the creator of Dennis the Menace cartoon, was living in Switzerland, I think, at the time. And occasionally he would get rides or flights in Learjets, maybe with Bill Jr. And every time Mr. Ketchum would get a ride in a Learjet, on his next cartoon episode of Dennis the Menace would be a little cartoon figure of the Learjet on Dennis the Menace's wall. So it was in hundreds of comic strips all over the country. So you always knew when he'd gotten a ride because there'd be a picture of a Learjet. Part of this component were world record flights to attract attention to the performance of the airplane. Time to climb to 40,000 feet, cross country, Clay did that, LA to New York and back, international flights, altitude flights. But these around the world flights were the capstone of the whole thing. And at one point in 1965, a very highly publicized jet commander flight, a competitor with Arthur Godfrey on board, was getting a lot of attention. And Bill Lear said, well, we can go around faster. What we'll do is we'll get Hank and other people in the airplane. We'll fly around the world silently first before the Godfrey flight, and then when they come back, we'll say congratulations, but we've already done it, and by the way, we beat your time quite a bit. So this all happened very rapidly. And the day of the flight, the strategy on PR was changed to get all the publicity you possibly can on this flight. Well, we had done no preparation at all, none. These guys left, and Jim and I were on the phones immediately calling everybody and around the world, and wire services and networks and so forth. We worked throughout that whole night. They left in the afternoon, as I remember. Yes. We worked all that night calling people and so forth. We went home about 5 in the morning to shave and get a shower. Jim Greenwood was in the shower about 7 in the morning. He gets a call from Bill Lear, who had turned on the Today Show, and there was no news of this around the world flight. He said, Greenwood, this is the best kept secret since the atom bomb.
We carried 1 can of oil as spare. We brought it back. And that's about all the spare parts we carried. And every place we stopped, the airplanes that were making trips around the world while we were had supplies at every base they were landing. And of course, they always wanted to know was Arthur Godfrey on board.
Yeah.
And when they weren't circling the globe in record time, Learjets were setting new standards for altitude performance, flying higher than any other non-military jet.
I remember when the Lear was real new and Bill would be flying it somewhere, and no one was up real high, you know, and there was only 5 Lears flying or so everybody would listen up and hear Lear, and Bill come on the radio and say, this is Lear 802LJ at flight level 460, and I mean 410. You know?
I was going south with Jim Burt to Mexico City, and at the border, the Mexican control, because they didn't have any altitude capability, says descend to 390, there's opposite traffic at 410. And Jim says, oh, the hell with them, we'll go to 430 and tell them we're at 39. So I report in that we are now level at 390, and I see this contrail coming at 410. And it was F. Lee Bailey.
Yeah, F. Lee Bailey.
And I told him who we were, and as he passes, underneath, there comes this cryptic voice. He says, Alex, if you're at 390, I'm flying upside down.
But even with its astounding performance, the Learjet couldn't build itself. And Bill Lear finally realized he was about to run out of money, long before he ran out of ideas. In 1967, he made a stunning decision, selling the company that he had founded, that was building the revolutionary airplane that bore his name, and had launched a whole new segment of aviation to the Gates Rubber Company.
The Gates Rubber Company came in with considerable financial stability, which allowed us to do some things in product development and so forth. And the fact that we needed to expand this owner base into these larger corporations and so forth. I think that was a good shifting of strategy. We were maturing as an organization. We had to mature as an organization, and we couldn't just be the flying by the seat of our pants as we had succeeded in doing for the first 4 or 5 years. The time was right, I think, to move on and to move out.
It's been 36 years since the Bill Lear era at Learjet ended, but the legacy he left behind continues. Learjet has become a household name, a virtual generic term for a business jet. Over the years since that first Lear 23 caused that memorable early evening traffic jam in Wichita, Learjets have continued to make their marks. The Learjet 28 and 29 were the first business jets certified to cruise at 51,000 feet, above most of the weather and all of the traffic.
Well, some of, when we went around the world, they weren't, if you got above 50, they didn't care where you went. They didn't even ask you your altitude.
We're going to run into it.
Yeah,
Well,
and
for sure.
we were trying to get over monsoons down in the Philippines and whatnot. We were 55 a lot of the time.
During the 70s and 80s, the Learjet 35 also set records of its own for sales, becoming one of the world's most popular light jets. In the 13 years since it was acquired by Bombardier, Learjet has benefited from an infusion of cash and creativity. The Learjet family of jets has experienced a renaissance of sorts. By the time Learjet celebrated the 30th anniversary of its first flight, 2 new Learjet models, the 31 and the 60, were in development. And in 1997, the first all-new Learjet since the Model 23, the Learjet 45, was certified as well. The new models 40 and 45 XR debuted in 2002 and will enter service later this year. In the decades since, Bombardier has revitalized and refined the Learjet family, rekindling the excitement of the legendary performance leaders. Today, 40 years after its first model flew, and 100 years after Wilbur and Orville Wright launched the era of powered flight, the Bombardier Learjet family, the models 40, 45, 45XR, and 60, continues to offer business travelers a unique combination of comfort and performance. And Bombardier has made owning and operating a Learjet easier and more affordable through its FlexJet fractional ownership program and SkyJet charter service, as well as conventional purchase. Though the concept of fractional ownership may seem relatively new, it seems Bill Lear may have had something pretty similar in mind 4 decades ago, even before that historic first flight.
A fellow named E.F. McDonald ordered one of the first Lears, and I flew him out to Palm Springs. He called me one day, said, "Can you pick me up in the morning? I want to go out and see Bill Lear. Bill wants me to come out to Palm Springs." And Justin Dart was there, and Bill was ready to go to Switzerland to build the airplane. But before he went, he wanted to be able to honestly say that he had some orders. So Justin Dart ordered 2, and McDonald ordered 1. It was the first 3 orders, and they were for $275,000 apiece. And I remember Bill saying they're all going to look alike. They're all going to have a red stripe, and the interior was going to be the same in every one. And he said, "I'm just waiting for the day." He said that, "McDonald, your airplane won't be available, but they'll borrow Dart's airplane, and you'll take off, and you'll say, 'What happened to my magazines I left in here?' Because he said you won't be able to tell the difference."
As it turned out, Bill Lear launched not only his own dream, but a legend, an industry, and a family of airplanes that have helped make a lot of other dreams come true. The colorful and exciting stories of those early days may have faded, but Bombardier's family of Learjet aircraft continues to make new memories and set new standards for performance and quality.